Marine Captain Brian Letendre died earlier this month in an explosion in Iraq. He was 27, a husband and father, and he was buried in Arlington National Cemetery, a few miles from where he grew up. As America observes Memorial Day,
I have been directed by the President of the United States and the Commandant of the Marine Corps to inform you that today, 0530, your son was killed in action while in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom.
Not very many of us can accomplish our goals or our dreams, and he always knew where he wanted to go, and he did it.
A Gold Star family is one who has lost a loved one serving in the United States military. It's a distinction no family ever seeks, a bond shared through sacrifice, remembrance, and profound loss. I'm Nick Letendre, and I've been a Gold Star sibling for over 18 years. In those 18 years, I've learned that while ceremonies fade, medals are stored away, and life continues, the story doesn't end for the families left behind. This podcast is dedicated to remembering those who gave everything for their country and to telling the lesser-known stories, the quiet, powerful journeys of grief, strength, resilience, and hope that follows after the flags are folded and the crowds disperse. These are Gold Star Stories. This episode of Gold Star Stories is brought to you by nobody yet, but it could be you. If you're a business or brand that believes in honoring sacrifice and preserving American stories, we're looking for partners. We don't want these families recording in garages with glitchy audio and folding chairs. They deserve a studio quality space, a comfortable environment, and most of all, to be heard by millions. If that's something you'd be proud to support, reach out, help us say their name, and help the world hear it. GoldStarStoriesUSA.com. Let's build this together. On today's episode of Gold Star Stories, I sit down with Ashley Southard, a mother, a widow, and a warrior of a different kind. Her husband, Sergeant Andy Southard, was a Black Hawk crew chief in the elite 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. He was killed in a training mission over the Mediterranean in November of 2023. This is still fresh, but Ashley doesn't hold back. She opens up about the day everything changed, the weight of sudden decisions, and what it's like to live in the shadow of sacrifice. We also talk about navigating family expectations and finding moments of grace when hope feels like a trap. This episode is raw, real, and exactly what Gold Star Stories is meant to be. All right, so tell me about who you are.
I am Ashley Southard. My husband was Sergeant Andy Southard. He was a Black Hawk crew chief in the 1st. We were stationed out of Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and his helicopter went down in the Mediterranean during a training mission while deployed in November of 2023.
Okay, so 2023, that is still very fresh.
Yes, very.
So tell me a little bit about how you got to know your husband and your relationship with him, obviously before this. Let's get to know him a little bit before we go into everything else.
Yeah, absolutely. Andy and I were best friends. We kind of met when we were both going through divorces, and he was about to deploy to Egypt for a year. And so our friends had kind of introduced us because we were going through similar things, and we hung out, but neither one of us were really looking for anything at the time, coming out of marriages and kind of starting over. So, and he, like I said, he was leaving for a year. So we just kind of jumped into like this very comfortable best friend. But it was always like we always knew each other. It was just this feeling of like being known when I was with him. And so it was very natural. And we talked the whole time. He was gone to Egypt. Then when he got back from Egypt, I coincidentally had taken a contract working with Fort Campbell, and he got stationed at Campbell. And so we hung out as friends for a little while. And then there was one Valentine's Day. We decided to just go out with each other for dinner. It was supposed to be a friends thing, and we left out of the little restaurant downtown, and the entire town was covered in snow. There was like probably 3 inches of snow on the ground, and we were throwing snowballs and making snow angels and just like having the best time. And he just looked at me and said, "I am so ridiculously in love with you, I can't stand it." And we were married 28 days later.
That is awesome. And when was that?
That was in February of 2021. We were married March of 2021.
Okay. So oftentimes, a lot of the marriage kind of turns into deployment. So was he deployed quite a bit once you guys got married?
Luckily, he had just, since he had come off that Egypt rotation. He had been deployed so much prior to that they kind of owed him some at-home time. So he got to stay home for a year and a half with 5101 with the Lancers at Fort Campbell. And he did have some TDYs. They sent him for some trainings. He became a flight instructor while he was there. And so there were some times that he was gone a little here and there, but we were actually really blessed that right after our marriage, we had quite a bit of time just together. As he assessed for the Special Forces unit he went into, things picked up quite a lot. He was gone quite a bit then, but the deployment that he died on was actually his first like blowout that we had ever experienced together. So I always tell everyone I was very spoiled, but I think the universe kind of worked in our favor so that we got as much time together as possible before he left the earth.
Can you tell me a little bit about him prior to joining the service and who he was as a person?
He's always been super outdoorsy. He grew up in Spokane, Washington until he was 10 when his dad retired out of the Air Force. Then they moved to his mom's hometown of Apache Junction, Arizona. And so he did a lot of outdoors things. He loved dirt biking with his dad and his best friend. They went to Moab quite often to kind of run those dunes over and over. He loved hiking. He loved fly fishing, just anything outdoors. He loved to just be moving. And that kind of carried on in our marriage. A lot of our early dates were hiking and in fact, even our wedding day, we hiked. He loved mountain biking and just anything that gave him an adrenaline rush. He was a bit of an adrenaline junkie. I think you have to be in aviation in the Army.
I think it matches the job a little bit.
Absolutely. And so he was just really into anything that gave him a thrill. And I think that carried over into his job as well. He joined when he was 19. And he died when he was 27, so he had quite a bit of time under his belt.
Can you tell me a little bit about the day that you found out? That knock on the door is always one of those powerful stories that kind of we break it into like the before and the after, I think.
Yeah, so I had this gut feeling when he got the call for the blowout. He had been put on alert and we had gone to a pumpkin patch that day. And I remember sitting at lunch with him and I couldn't finish my margarita. And I said, "Oh, you take it." And he said, "Well, I probably shouldn't because I'm on call and they could call me." And I remember thinking, oh, they're not going to call him. Like it was just this very, I don't know, a surreal feeling. And then the second the phone rang, and it was on a Saturday, and you know, when work calls on a Saturday, like what that means. And so the second I got the call, I just had this drop in my stomach. I just had this like overwhelming, nauseous feeling. And he left, and then he died 26 days after they deployed. And I remember the day before I was notified, we had talked that morning, we had FaceTimed with my daughter. And then around dinner time, I had sent him a picture of our daughter. She had like draped like ramen noodles around her face. And it was so funny. And I'd sent the picture and I noticed a couple hours later, it just didn't go through. And I thought that was odd because his phone was never dead. That was something he was very diligent about. And I thought, well, maybe he doesn't have service. He did say he would be flying later tonight. And then it got like 9:30, and then it got like 10:30. And I just had this feeling. And I remember sitting down and crying. And, you know, I think as a spouse in this position, the only thing you can do is reach out to other spouses. The only thing you can do is kind of try to grasp whatever information you can. And I had reached out to other spouses whose husbands I knew were only maintainers and that they didn't fly. And I said, you know, have you heard from your husband? And when they told me they hadn't heard from theirs yet, I kind of took a breath a little because I didn't understand that when an accident happens or when something like that happens, that the comms go black and you're not going to hear anything for a while. There was a bit of naivety to that process for me. So, but around midnight, I just had this feeling. I just had this gut feeling. And I remember saying out loud, "I just need to know you're okay." And I don't know even what possessed me to say it out loud. It was just something that I felt strongly to do. And at that exact moment, only his stocking fell from the mantle. And they had been up for 2 weeks. I decorate for Christmas the night of Halloween. So his stocking fell, and I just kind of got this feeling that like that was him. And so I wasn't notified till 4 o'clock the next day, but I feel like I knew in those moments. And now looking back, I can remember like subconsciously just like glancing towards the door over and over again. And now I know that I was waiting for that knock to come. But at the time, it just felt like a nervous thing to do. And so that next day, I remember showering. I was still blowing up his phone. I said, I'm going to go shower. I'm going to feed us lunch. And then we're just going to take a deep breath. I'm sure, I was going through every possible scenario. His phone fell out of the helicopter. He's lost his watch before. He's lost a hat here and there. So I was like, that's plausible. And I've spoken a lot about, and I've written a lot about in my book, that if there's this sense of hope that comes with waiting for that knock at the door, and that is almost the worst feeling. That hope that you have that that's not going to happen, or that isn't what's coming, is almost more painful to hang on to than like the reality hitting you, because when that reality does hit you, all that hope just kind of rushes out of you and you're left feeling so empty and so void. And so I remember I turned the corner of our living room and I saw them before they knocked. I saw, just the fuzziness outline of two blue uniforms through the like textured pane glass of our door. And I heard the knock and I kind of peered around and I stood there and I just had this moment of clarity where I thought the second I open that door, my world is going to change. So I just stood there staring at it for about 5 to 7 minutes, just kind of knowing what was on the other side and also dreading, just kind of wanting to live in that one last moment where I didn't know. And then that hope kind of surged forward again, where I was like, they're going to tell you he's hurt in a hospital overseas and you need to pack a bag. And so I remember it was 22 steps from my living room to the front door. I counted them, 22 steps. And I got to the door and I took a deep breath and I opened the door. And the second I saw their faces, I kind of knew that they weren't there with pack a bag news. And what's funny about that moment to me, looking back, funny in a nonsensical way, is that I don't actually remember them telling me he died. I don't remember hearing it. I remember him asking me over and over again, "Are you Ashley Southard, wife of Sergeant Andrew Southard?" And I remember I couldn't understand why he was asking me that. And I thought it was irrelevant and I was a little annoyed. And his voice started to break about the third or fourth time he asked me because I was just staring. And I remember saying, "Is he?" And then my voice broke and it kind of trailed off. And he said, "Ma'am, I just need you to confirm that you're Ashley Southard, wife of Sergeant Andrew Southard." And I said, "Yeah, I am." And I think, I don't know, maybe the blood rushing to my ears, maybe it was my body's way of protecting me, but I can't remember what he said or how he said it. Looking back through my memory, I can kind of remember seeing the formation of words like sorry and mishap and deceased on his mouth, but I don't actually remember hearing it. And I think that played a huge part in the weeks to come where I just truly didn't believe he was gone. It didn't feel real. The denial stage of that was so heavy for me. When someone dies while deployed, you've already had this like separation from them. So it's hard to fill that void with facts when it's so hard to grasp that they're gone.
For the longest time, I had always assumed like, hey, there's still that possibility that my brother was just doing like a secret mission. You know what I mean? They had to make it seem like he died to really sell the mission. They had to even sell it to us back home because obviously, when you're in that type of situation, you got to be real deep about it. And in the back of your head, it's ridiculous, but also it's just that like just little sliver of hope. For me, I didn't realize that I wasn't crazy until I spoke to other like siblings about it that had the same thought process, that everybody kind of goes through that denial process of grief, and it's intense. So after finding out, you kind of go, it already sounds like you started going into your blur. It's a very common theme across this is that you just kind of find out and you're just kind of just like, what the hell do I do now? A lot of people kind of automatically go into that problem solving theme too, where they're like, well, let's make sure that this is all correct. What were your next steps after that? Do you remember what happened after getting the news?
Just kind of launching into a dissociation, fugue state almost. I've always said that dying in the Army is a business because almost immediately I was met with paperwork and picking out urns and picking out caskets. And 8 hours after they notified me, they handed me plane tickets to receive his remains back into the United States. So I knew I would be
It
boarding a
was that
plane.
quick.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so there was a time frame where there was a rescue mission as well. In my husband's case specifically, only 2 bodies were recovered immediately, my husband being one of them. And so there was some rescue effort and there was also some resuscitation effort. And I think that caused quite the delay in notification. So that kind of ate up that time in between being notified and him coming home. And
Makes
so
sense.
we boarded the flight. It was the first time flying with my daughter, who was 15 months old at the time. And I remember like, I was like, okay, well, this is what we're doing. Like, I have to go.
Is this just you and your daughter boarding the flight by yourselves? You didn't have anybody else going with you?
My mom did end up driving up and going with me.
Okay.
She lived about 6 hours away. So the second I called her, she kind of jumped in the car. So she went with me, as well as my CAO, that guided process. So we went to Dover, received his remains back into the U.S. My in-laws met us there. They were in Arizona. They met us at Dover. And that was a really that was an awful experience. If I'm being candid, that there was nothing about that experience. There never is in this situation, but we weren't prepared that we wouldn't get to see him or that, I wouldn't get to touch his casket or anything like that. It was, we showed up to witness the transfer and then we were kind of shuttled away pretty quickly. And I think that kind of added to a lot of that trauma for me because I was still grasping that it wasn't him, kind of like you did. I thought, well, my husband's an outdoorsman. He's a great swimmer. He swam to some remote island and he is Tom Hanks with a Wilson volleyball and we just have to go find him. And I remember like looking up which way the current was flowing and like the weather in that area and the surrounding islands. And if I could chart a helicopter myself to go like explore them, there was just this deep need to like finalize it for me. And so the fact that they wouldn't let me see him in Dover kind of added to that for me. And that was really hard. But I feel like I was launched into this business state. Like everything was so black and white. There was paperwork, there were binders and folders kind of thrown at me. There was picking out and I was 32 when he died. And so I'd never planned a funeral before. Both my parents are still alive, all my grandparents are still alive. Like I've never really been to a funeral. And so that was super overwhelming. And I think my response to all of that was just to completely dissociate because there's, like you said, it was such a blur. I have a lot of memory loss from that time frame. And yeah, I feel like I went into business mode and problem solving mode and checking the boxes mode. And that was really overwhelming.
One thing I think a lot of people don't think about too is the amount of stress that's put on the spouse to suddenly have all of these decisions to make. And it's maybe you discussed it before, maybe you didn't. Everybody's different, obviously. But now you're making decisions that the entire family is going to have opinions about, possibly. And there's no right answer to it. There's making every single person happy to it, but somebody's got to make that decision. And that's an incredible amount of weight to put on one person. Did you experience anything like that where you were just like, man, these decisions I'm making just feel like they're too much and I need to maybe like find somebody else to help me through?
There were lots of decisions that I felt were placed on me immediately, as well as lots of information that I had but didn't necessarily know what it was. Like we had a death folder and we had prepped for this and I knew he wanted to be cremated and I knew, where he wanted his ashes spread. But there are questions you don't know to ask until they're asked, and you can't possibly know. I mean, I think that this community, the Gold Star community, is essential in helping, active duty spouses prepare for that. But there were questions like, did he want to be in a funeral home? Did he want military honors? Did he want to be buried in his dress blues? Did he want to be buried in his flight uniform? There were so many different aspects of that I had no clue about, as well as there were a lot of eyes on me. Pretty immediately, the media camped outside my house. My husband's death was highly publicized because of where it happened in the time frame it happened in the political realm. And so there was a lot of media attention. There were reporters constantly, they were reaching out to people I went to high school with, just trying to get the story. And so there was so much pressure on me from all sides that I kind of got decision fatigue, where I was just like, I very genuinely don't care. I need someone else to make this decision. And looking back, it's a really sad part of my story in the after, because I think I was robbed of so much of that saying goodbye process, so much of that, I guess, realization, and also like getting to just exist with his body in a casket in a room. There were so many things that like I felt like I was either robbed of, or I don't remember, because I was so task saturated, as well as there were so many eyes on me. There were so many people looking to me to make decisions. There were so many people expecting me to act a certain way and do a certain. I remember at his funeral, I couldn't cry. I don't know why. I was devastated, but I think I'd cried so much. I just couldn't cry. And I remember thinking, like, you have to make yourself cry, or these people are going to think you didn't love your husband. And there was just this weight of expectation and judgment almost immediately for me. And that was really heavy to carry as well.
The pressure is immense, and I'd always sympathize with my sister-in-law on that aspect of it. We haven't always seen eye to eye on everything since, but I know that a lot of, why she does what she does is because of what she went through and because of the weight that was put on her. And I know that my parents were trying to be as graceful as they could during the situation, but they were grieving too, and it's so hard to it almost feels like competing at a certain extent when you get to these things. And my family did not have the support system to kind of figure out how to like get through that competition and come together and just love each other for him. Instead, it came to like, hey, who's going to step up and do these things? This person got invited, this person didn't get invited. And it turns into this whole like tense moment of like, should I have told this person that I got invited, or they didn't tell me they got invited to this and I just saw them on TV. And it turns into an absolute circus at some point. And it takes it away from the main meaning, and it takes away from family. And a lot of people don't understand how deep this stuff goes. Have you had any experiences like that where you were just like, maybe there's a misunderstanding? I don't want you to necessarily call anybody out. I'm not trying to start drama.
No. I've talked about this a lot with my in-laws. Almost immediately, I think that there was this divide. We're great now. We're very close. My mother-in-law's coming in on Friday, and they're very supportive of me and my life and very involved in my daughter's life now. But when it first happened, there was this disconnect, and I think this is very common through military deaths and civilian deaths, is that they lost the child and the boy that they raised, a part of their identity, a part of who they grew up being, a part of, someone's identity as a parent is so wrapped in their child, I think. And for the spouse, for me, from my side, I saw him as a man, and I saw him as my spouse and my partner, the person I went to sleep beside every night, the person I shared my most intimate thoughts with, and vice versa. And those two will never marry, and they're not supposed to. That is the divide between an intimate relationship and a familial one. But when death occurs, it is very, very hard to change perspectives because you are dealing with grief. I think in any other circumstance, we are able to put ourselves in the other person's shoes, but grief is so unnatural to carry for humans, I think. And because it is so heavy, there's no room for anything else. And so a lot of times that anger does come forward, and that miscommunication happens, and you're so exhausted from just trying to go through the day without that person existing that you don't have the energy for tact or couth or being able to like articulate what you're saying in a way that isn't miscommunicated. And so I think right away there was a lot of that. I've talked about this a lot, and he wouldn't mind me saying it, but my father-in-law, he wanted to come get my husband's things the week he died. He said, I want to come pick up X, Y, and Z. And I wasn't ready to part with any of those things. And it created a bit of a divide between us until we talked much later on. And I said, these were memories. These were memories for my children and attached to my children. And I was also still in the denial stage. And in my mind, if I kept everything pristine, if I didn't touch any of his things, his clothing, the stuff in the garage, that made the likelihood that he was going to come home and touch it again higher in my brain in that denial stage. And for my in-laws, they hadn't seen him in so long because he had a family and he was in the military and he had been gone so long. They were looking for tangibility because they didn't have it prior to that. And now in the after, we're almost 2 years out. We can both see that from both sides, and we give each other grace now, both for our actions then and for continuing to live that way. But back then, that grief is so heavy, you don't have room to be gracious to anyone. And I think that was the biggest realization for me, was that typically I would try to explain myself. I just didn't have the energy.
2 years is still very fresh to me. I'm 19 years on, and I'm sure I don't ever give anybody advice on how to handle this shit because I'm not the person to give the advice on it. But how did you come to figuring this out so quickly? Were you involved with TAPS quickly or anything like that? Were there any organizations you can give credit to helping you navigate this?
No, and I'm afraid my answer doesn't help too many people. My husband was so kind. He was so kind. He was so understanding. He was the golden retriever of our relationship. And I thought the best way to honor him was to be the best parts of him, to live the best parts of him. And I knew what he wanted of me. Even though I felt jaded at times, or I felt wronged, or I felt betrayed, and I wanted to act on those emotions, I just kind of channeled what he would want or what he would do in that situation, because I admired those things about him and I wanted to keep those parts alive, at least for my daughter. I wanted her to still have that example. And so a lot of people have asked that question, how did you mend that relationship? And I just kept reaching my hand out, and it got smacked quite a few times, but I just kept reaching. And eventually there was enough water under the bridge, or time, or, whatever it was, that it was finally accepted. And I think that was important on both parts. And I think just acknowledging that we both were going through really, really hard times. And for me as well, there were outside factors. It wasn't just me and my in-laws. It was everyone around us kind of feeding the fire and fanning the flames and adding their own 2 cents, or I would never do that, or I can't believe she did that, or there were all these opinions around us. And I've often talked about how that business part goes away after you've checked all the boxes and you've done all the things. When that goes away, it's quiet. And everyone has gone back to their lives at that point. All the memorials are over. And that is when grief is the heaviest for us, I think, because now all of a sudden it's quiet and you're left alone with the grief that you've been putting off for so long. And so I think with that aspect, there was time for me to consider my actions, to consider the things that I said that I was wrong about, and taking accountability for that as well.
So I think another theme that keeps coming up in a lot of these conversations is, how would you want people to interact with you at this point? Like, we get to a point where people don't know how to reach out to us anymore. This is a very deep thing that a lot of people don't know how to approach. They're not sure, should I always be like, oh, hey, I'm honoring your husband, honoring your brother, or thinking about you. I try to tell people, like, hey, don't just reach out to me constantly and remind me of my brother. Like, that's not, I would like a relationship with you in general too, just be like, hey, how are you? Unfortunately, I'm so thankful that you remember my brother. Don't get me wrong, but check in on my mom, check in on my dad, check in on us as people, because we're the ones that are here still dealing with this year after year. And the only time we ever hear from you is right around the anniversary at this point. And all that doesn't help us anymore. We're remembering it every single day. You just told us you remembered it on the anniversary. Thanks. You know what I mean? Like, check in just once in a while and just be like, hey, how are you? You know, we don't have to talk about it at all. 18 years on, I'm fine. We don't have to talk about it every single discussion. But like, check in and just be like, hey, how are you? You know, do you have any feelings on that at all?
I do. I share your sentiment where I hate that every conversation, I'm not a person, I'm a widow. You know, I'm this almost tangible piece of him still that people reach out for, and I respect that. But I also would love to be acknowledged as a person who is still living this, who's rebuilding her life, who's raising his daughter. And there are so many aspects of that I wish other people acknowledged. There are two of his friends that he was very close to in life that do a really good job of that. And just recently, my birthday came up and they sent me funny stuff in the mail, like just stuff to give me a laugh, just to let me know they were thinking of me. One of them, who is really close with my husband, they've roomed at a lot of their TDYs and stuff together. He got a new girlfriend recently, and she told him it was Books and Roses Day, and he remembered that my husband always celebrated that for me. It's just one of those silly holidays that pops up, you know. And he goes, Andy would send her stuff for that, and he said, I want to send her something because Andy would have. And so he had his new girlfriend go through my Goodreads and find what books that I was like interested in reading, and he sent me Books and Roses, and just like a funny little card that, you know, kind of alluded to my husband, but it wasn't directly about it. And he just still treated me like a person that still mattered and honored me in a way that my husband would.
That's awesome. That's the kind of people you want to keep in your life. So you mentioned that you had a book coming out. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
So I read a lot of books. I'm a big reader. If you see the books behind me, I'm a big reader. And so I turned to books when my husband died to try to find some way to move forward, some manual I could follow to just make that pain go away. So I started reading a lot of books after he died, just looking for a way forward. And I would get super angry because they were all inspirational and they were all in that stage of grief where someone had already processed what was going on, or they had already come to this point in their grief journey where they found meaning or they found purpose. And I wasn't there yet. And there was no meaning or purpose that would ever be enough for me when I was going through the trenches of it. I wanted someone to tell me that it was terrible, that it was awful, to acknowledge that this shouldn't have happened to me and it really was as bad as it was, and validate that terrible, awful. And I think people shy away from doing that because they don't want to bring attention to the obvious. Like, obviously it's terrible. They want to make you feel better. They want you to stop hurting. But for me, I wanted to be validated in that this is the worst thing ever. And so I wrote that. I started writing it. I started detailing all the little parts of grief that I had no idea existed, all the little like quips and things, and how grief isn't linear. And we say that all the time, but you don't know the truth of it until you're living it. Because, you know, just 2 months ago, I'm washing my hair in the shower and I think I should move the life insurance money to a separate account. So when they ask for it back, when he comes home, it's easy to transfer and we don't have to do this nickel and dime game. And I stayed in that thought process the whole time I was washing my hair. So like, you know, 4 to 7 minutes. And then it hit me, he's not coming home. But that's what I mean. Like everyone else seemed to like detail the steps of grief, but not that they pop up randomly, not that they're not linear, not that they coexist and then exist completely separately. So I kind of just wrote that, my experience, and I wanted to give people that weren't ready for the meaningful and the purposeful something to turn to that made them feel validated in their feelings. And I talk a lot about some of the feelings that come up that we might be ashamed to say out loud. How angry I was at my husband, how I never wanted him to go special forces, how it made me so angry that he lived his dream job and he died doing it, but he was my dream. And there was so much of that I felt shame in saying, but was so normal when I talked to other Gold Star spouses. And so I just wanted to say the thing out loud that nobody wants to say out loud, so that no one else felt as alone as I felt going through that process.
I'm a big fan of saying the thing out loud. That's kind of what this is all about, is trying to bring light into these gold star stories that everybody kind of struggles to fully understand the entire grasp of it. This isn't just they're buried and we move on. This is something that we end up living day in and day out for decades. You can it just pops up out of nowhere. We don't get to just move on. We get to kind of navigate this, and we hope that by talking about it, other people understand. My goal is to build a support system for my mother, and to give her a platform that she can finally speak out and kind of share her story. She feels like she's not as eloquently spoken as everybody else. And I said, Mom, I don't care. That's not what this is about. She is 100% the most gold star mother you could possibly find. And just because she's not well spoken doesn't mean she shouldn't get to share her story. So I was like, if she's not comfortable talking to anybody else, she'll be comfortable talking to her baby boy, So come on in, let's talk. And if you mess up, we can just cut it out and we'll make sure you look good. But she finally called me today and she's so excited. She's like, started thinking about it. She goes, I've really started thinking about this. And like, there's so many things I want to share because, my brother was killed on May 3rd, and then he was buried basically right on Mother's Day, which was right around the same time as his birthday. So this like 2-week span for her was just like absolute hell. And she goes, I've never really gotten to tell anybody about how terrible of a 2 weeks that was. And I was like, yeah, we absolutely should share that story because not only do you deserve to be heard, but it needs to be heard by people to fully understand the sacrifices these guys have made.
Absolutely. My mother-in-law was unfortunately notified on her birthday. They knocked on the door on her birthday. And so she shares a lot of that semblance of now her birthday forever is marked by this. It wasn't the day he died, but it was the day she found out. And that's a grief to carry forward forever. And I wanted to speak to something with you being a sibling. One of the guys that was in the crash with my husband, he had a sister. He wasn't married, he didn't have children, but he had a sister. And I've noticed how, and I cover some of this in my book, I've noticed how often she's disregarded as a sibling in the grieving process, how often she's kind of looked over. People look to the spouse or they look to the parents, but so often the sibling is just kind of glossed over, like, oh, it was just your brother or it was just your sister. But that's a part of your identity. That's a part of who you grew up, who you are is shaped so much of growing up beside that person, the games you played, that was your built-in best friend.
Absolutely.
And I hate how often she is just like, we all got letters from various organizations, people in the military, people in government, and she didn't get any. And, like she has said, that was my best friend. I talked to my brother every single day. And so my eyes have been opened to the dynamics of how people treat different grievers in their relationship to the person who passed, because they tell her, well, it was just your brother, but that's half of who she grew up being.
Yeah, I mean, in my instance, my brother was 9 years older than me, so he was literally like everything that I based myself off of. He played soccer, I played soccer. He was going into the Marine Corps, I joined a Marine Corps Junior ROTC in high school. It was that kind of a relationship. And then when all this happens, all of a sudden I'm literally cut to the side. And I'm not one to complain, I'll sit back and stuff, but I don't have contact with any of the Marines that he served with. None of them decided to stay in contact with me. No family or anything like that. My kids are left with no uncles. My other brother has basically just gone off and done his own thing because it's too much to handle. My dad, too much for him to handle, so he's off. My kids have no family left because of this. But I'm just the sibling, so it didn't matter that much to me. And it's just, come on, guys. Like, really? My parents instead. So it is tough. It is tough as a sibling because you got to be like, hey, I'm left. I'm responsible for looking after my parents. This is such a dramatic and tragic loss for them. For years, it took me years to really even cry over it because I just felt like I didn't have not the right, but like it just didn't feel appropriate as an appropriate response for me. Now that I have kids, I've got a son that's named after him exactly. I cry like a baby. I don't care. They're, the memories, whether they're good, they're sad, they're not. My kids will see me cry. I don't care. I feel like that's just, part of being a man and, sharing your emotions like that kind of stuff. So.
Yeah, I agree. And a lot of that pressure, you're talking about pressure put on the spouse, but I feel like a lot of that pressure is put on, the children that are left behind as well, because those parents, start looking at you like, well, this is the son I have left, or this is the daughter I have left. And I think a lot of weight gets put on them, and there's a weight to carry of, am I going to live up to my brother? Am I going to live up to the expectations of them? And I think there's a huge dynamic to be spoken about in that space, where there's so much pressure put on various members of that person's family after they die, and how they deal with the grief and how they carry forward.
One of the other siblings I spoke to earlier in one of my episodes, her name was Andy Hefty, had said that she basically told her mom at one point that, it is really hard to live in his shadow. Like, I can't anymore. Like, he's dead, and yet you're still choosing to go to like memorial events for him over helping me with my children, and I'm still here. I'm dying to get your attention, and I can't get it from you. So it's that, we have to grow in the shadow. And I agree. It's the same way for me. My kids don't have that support system on my side because of that shadow,
Mm-hmm.
It's just too much for everybody to handle. So there is, there's a lot to be said on that subject that I'm sure I'll go into it. So tell me, I was curious because I saw that you had a rather large TikTok following. How did that amass? Was that because of all of this happening?
So I started out creating like mom content when I was pregnant with my daughter. I had started creating content, but I had like 80,000 followers at the time that I had built up. And then it kind of fell off. My daughter had colic, and I was just really enmeshed in motherhood and the trenches of newborn hood and my husband. And so I hadn't posted in probably like 8, 9 months. And then when he died, I noticed my friends were really burnt out. I noticed that I was saying the same stories. And I also noticed that I also felt responsible for their feelings and their reactions to my pain. And I kept, I wasn't okay, but I'd be like, but I'm okay. Like, I would say something, or I would cry, or I'd break down. I'd be like, no, it's fine. I'm okay. But I wasn't. But I needed them to kind of feel better. It was a very strange weight to carry. So, one night I was lonely, and my friends had all kind of gone back to their lives, and I just opened up my TikTok and started talking. And it was so easy. It was something I could throw away. It felt like I was just tossing it into the abyss. I had my notifications turned off. I could film the video, post it, and then I didn't have to open the app again. I didn't have to read the comments or anything. And it just felt like a way to get it out, to throw my feelings and not have to manage the expectations of the person in front of me. And in doing that, I accidentally amassed a following of grievers who, resonated with what I was saying, or, said, you're putting into words what I've been feeling and didn't know how to say. And so I kind of created a following by accident, just kind of sharing what I was currently going through. And as time has gone on, it's continued to grow as I've shared the different aspects of grief, and people follow me to help their friends and family who are grieving. There was a incident recently, the soldiers that passed away in Lithuania. Almost immediately, 2 of those widows reached out to me because they had seen my content, and they knew that I was a safe place to come to. And I have been able to help them navigate the things that I didn't know how to navigate in those early stages. And so it's really been a blessing, and it's been a way for me to give back to that community, as well as a way to just kind of process my grief.
That's the beauty of social media too, is a lot of people, I don't think, necessarily feel comfortable reaching out to some of the bigger organizations, but maybe they see you and they see that you have a shared experience, and just that interaction with you can completely change the trajectory of their grief or their life or how they're thinking about things. So absolutely wonderful that you are doing it, and you've, created your group of people. And I think it's important to have this kind of stuff, what you're saying, what we're talking about here, for people to be able to hear in general. God forbid they ever have to be in one of our positions. They'll understand a little more. Hopefully they don't have to be in our position, but even those that never will be will understand a little more about, the deepness of all of this. I'll go ahead and cut it here, and I would love to connect with you again at some point. My goal for this is to grow it bigger into a studio and actually make this something that I don't continually have, tech issues with. I've got some discussions with companies later today, and If I get to that point, I'd love to have you back at some point so that we can do this properly without my camera tech going out again. And I'm sure you have more stories to share. Quick note before we close, if you're a company or organization interested in sponsoring this series, this is your chance. This moment, this exact spot, could be your ad. We have big dreams for Gold Star Stories. We want to turn this into the ultimate storytelling experience for these families with professional sound, a welcoming space to record in, and the tools needed to share these legacies with millions. Because these families deserve more than scratchy Zoom calls and duct tape tech setups. They deserve their stories to be heard clearly, powerfully, and with honor. So if you're someone who believes in the power of remembrance and the responsibility to preserve it, reach out. Together, we can say their names louder than ever. Before we close out today's conversation, I just want to take a second to acknowledge the weight of everything Ashley shared. What you heard today wasn't just a timeline, it was love, it was shock, it was motherhood and grief tangled up in a story still unfolding. Ashley opened up the door to some of the hardest moments a person can live through, and she did it with raw honesty, not because it's easy, but because Andy's life deserves that kind of truth. So before we go, we do what we always do here. We pause, we remember, and we raise a glass. To Sergeant Andy Southard, a husband, a father, a son, a friend, a soldier who didn't just serve, but soared. To the Black Hawk crew chief who was always chasing the next adrenaline rush, whether it was a dirt bike in Moab or a mountain trail on foot, who loved fast, lived hard, and somehow made you feel safe in the chaos. To the man who made snow angels on a Valentine's night and said, "I'm so ridiculously in love with you, I can't stand it." Who married the love of his life 28 days later and packed a lifetime into the years that followed. To the leader who trained others with patience, who carried the weight of responsibility with quiet strength, who left behind not just a uniform, but kids who will grow up knowing their dad is a damn hero. To the soldier who climbed aboard a bird over the Mediterranean and never made it home, but who still shows up in fallen Christmas stockings, quiet wins in the fierce determination of the woman he left behind. And to Ashley, who honors Andy not just by telling his story, but by living the best parts of him every single day, who continues to reach across grief, across distance, across pain, and build bridges instead of walls. Because of her, Andy's story isn't just remembered, it's felt. Say their name, Sergeant Andy Southard. If this episode stirred something in you, don't let it stop here. Share it, talk about it, ask questions, and most importantly, remember it. Sergeant Andy Southard was more than his rank, more than the headlines. He was a husband, a dad, a hiker, a dreamer, a trainer, a teammate, and a man who left an imprint on everyone lucky enough to know him. Ashley is proof that grief doesn't end a story. It hands you the pen to keep writing it. Thank you for listening to Gold Star Stories. I'm Nick Letendre. We'll see you next time. Until then, check in on your people and always, always say their names. A special thanks to our few supporters. We hope to add your name to this list too. June Letendre, Jackie Mullins, Danielle Metal, and Terry Mullins.